Tragedy! Tragedy!
Macbeth and Schroeder, Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, King Lear.
William Shakespeare!
Two households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona where we lay our scene. From ancient grudge break to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. From forth the fatal loins of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life, whose misadventured piteous overthrows doth, with their death, bury their parents' strife.
That about says it. We all remember, or we think we remember, the basic story of Romeo and Juliet. Star-crossed lovers and all that. So let's take a quick look at the plot.
Section A, the plot of Romeo and Juliet.
We've got two major families in the play, the Montagues and the Capulets, and they're feuding with each other. Let's look at the Montague side first. There's Romeo, a young man, and his parents, Montague and Lady Montague. Romeo has two buddies, Mercutio and Benvolio. Okay, on to the other family involved in the feud, the Capulets. First off, there's Juliet, a young girl, and her parents, Capulet and Lady Capulet. There's also Juliet's cousin, Tybalt, and Juliet's nanny, the nurse. Also, on the Capulet side is Paris. We have two other main characters, both of whom hope to end the feud between the Montagues and the Capulets, Friar Lawrence and the Prince of Verona.
Finally, we've got a special character, the Chorus, who shows up from time to time to comment on the goings-on in the play.
The Capulets and the Montagues, two prominent families in Verona, Italy, are in the midst of a feud. Kind of like the Hatfields and the McCoys, except these guys use swords instead of shotguns. So the play starts with a little skirmish between members of the two families. The Prince of Verona comes in and tells them to knock it off, and declares that from now on, anyone found fighting will be put to death.
Then we meet Romeo, a Montague, who's bummed out because he's in love with Rosaline, this woman who wants nothing to do with him. Benvolio, Romeo's buddy, comes by to suggest that they have some fun by crashing a party at the Capulets that night. You see, Benvolio thinks this will help cure Romeo of his puppy love. But how, you may ask, can they sneak into a party hosted by their sworn enemies? Lucky for them, it's a masked ball.
At the ball, Romeo sees Juliet, and the poor guy just falls head over heels in love with a fair young maiden. They talk, they kiss, they fall in love. You know, the whole boy meets girl thing. But the plot thickens. Juliet, remember, is a Capulet, the sworn enemy of Romeo's family, the Montagues. Meanwhile, Tybalt, one of the Capulets, and so an enemy to Romeo, recognizes our hero. Tybalt wants to fight him, but the host, old Capulet, warns him against disturbing the party. So Tybalt leaves, totally ticked off, and then Juliet's mother calls to her and she leaves. Later that night, Juliet finds out from her servant, the nurse, that Romeo is a Montague, so she's kind of bummed about it. Romeo hides below Juliet's window where, unaware of his presence, she professes her love for him, but also her sadness at discovering he's a Montague. Romeo shows himself, and much love talking ensues. The couple then makes plans to get married secretly the next day.
So, the next morning, Romeo asks the friar for his help in getting this marriage thing off the ground. Well, the friar thinks that if these two marry, it may end the feud between their families, so he agrees. So with the help of the nurse, the friar secretly marries Romeo and Juliet.
Okay, later on the streets of Verona, Tybalt, that Capulet guy who's really mad at Romeo, encounters one of Romeo's buddies, Mercutio. So Mercutio and Tybalt start arguing, and Romeo happens to come by. Well, Tybalt tries to pick a fight with Romeo, but Romeo doesn't want to fight him now that they're sort of related to each other. Remember, Romeo and Juliet are now married, and Tybalt is related to Juliet. Mercutio doesn't understand why his pal Romeo won't fight, so he starts fighting with Tybalt. Romeo tries to stop the fight, but Tybalt stabs and kills Mercutio. In a rage at his friend's death, Romeo kills Tybalt. Not good. Romeo quickly leaves the scene before the prince gets there. The prince finds out what happened and how Tybalt was the aggressor in the fight, so he doesn't condemn Romeo to death, but banishes him from Verona.
Juliet hears of the two deaths from the nurse and becomes quite distraught. When night falls, Romeo sneaks into Juliet's room and the two spend the night together. The next morning, Romeo reluctantly leaves for Mantua. Now, to complicate matters, Juliet's father decides she should be married in 3 days' time to Paris, a family friend and kinsman of the prince. So here's what we've got.
Romeo and Juliet are married, but only the friar and the nurse know it. Tybalt killed Mercutio, and Romeo killed Tybalt. Romeo is banished from Verona, and Juliet is set to be married to Paris, a family friend of the Capulets.
Here it gets really intriguing. Juliet's family makes arrangements for her to marry the guy Paris. Juliet goes to the friar for help. The friar has a plan. He tells Juliet to accept the marriage, but he gives her this sleeping potion. It will make her appear dead, and her family will stick her in the burial vault. There, Romeo will sneak in, and they can steal away together to Mantua. Sounds like a great plan. Yeah, right. This is Romeo and Juliet, folks, not an episode of Three's Company.
Now, the friar was supposed to send a letter to Romeo saying, "No, your girlfriend isn't actually dead. She's just really, really sleepy." Well, Romeo never got that note because the messenger was quarantined on the way to Mantua. So Romeo hears from someone else that Juliet really is dead. Grief-stricken, he buys some real poison and makes his way to the Capulet burial vault.
Things get a little convoluted here, but the upshot is this. Romeo stands over Juliet, who he thinks is dead. He professes his eternal love for her, drinks the poison, and dies. Juliet awakes shortly thereafter, sees her beloved husband dead next to her, and stabs herself. News of the deaths travels quickly, and the Capulets and the Montagues all gather at the vault. They hear the tragic tale of the two young lovers, and together they vow to end their feud.
That's the basic plot of Romeo and Juliet. How does this play fit into Shakespeare's writing career at the time? Well, he took a break from writing tragedies for a few years after Titus Andronicus. He wrote history plays like Richard II and King John, comedies like Love's Labour's Lost and Two Gentlemen of Verona, and even found free time to write some of the best dang sonnets you'll ever want to hear.
Around 1595, Shakespeare returned to tragedy by adapting a 30-year-old verse poem by Arthur Brooke, The Tragical History of Romeus and Juliet.
He made a lot of changes to the source material. Shakespeare did keep a lot of the plot and characters, and he avoided the moralistic lesson pronounced in Brooke's preface to his poem.
In this preface, Brooke says that the two main characters are punished because they've defied their parents by pursuing an illicit affair. Now, the actual poem isn't as sermonizing as Brooke's preface promised.
Still, Shakespeare's dramatic version is a major improvement over the narrative poem. In short, the playwright introduced three major changes in Romeo and Juliet.
1. Shakespeare greatly reduced the time of the action from several months to just a few days, giving the play a sense of rush. 2. He greatly expanded the character and role of Mercutio, and he fleshed out the character of the nurse. And 3. Shakespeare transformed Brooks's pedestrian verse into some of the finest lyrical poetry found in his plays up to that point.
Hey, to talk about Romeo and Juliet, we're going to hit you with some pretty cool stuff, like the play's poetry, the unique characters, the intriguing plot, and how Romeo and Juliet works as a tragedy.
Section B, the poetry of Romeo and Juliet.
Around the time he wrote Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare was also writing a lot of sonnets.
The sonnet is a poetic form. It has 14 lines, primarily written in iambic pentameter, with a complex rhyming form.
Shakespeare wrote a lot of famous sonnets. You might even recognize the one that starts out, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate."
Shakespeare chose quite naturally love poetry. The imagery and the figures of speech of Romeo and Juliet were inspired by the early Renaissance Italian poet Petrarch, whose love sonnets were very popular in Shakespeare's day. So we like to refer to the poetry, the verse, of Romeo and Juliet as Petrarchan.
For instance, as you read through the first few scenes of Act 1, pay attention to the recurring image of light that Shakespeare uses, especially in the words of Romeo in scenes 2 and 4. Shakespeare continues this imagery as our hero first sets eyes on Juliet in Scene 5. Oh, she doth teach the torches to burn bright. It seems she hangs upon the cheek of night as a rich jewel in an Ethiop's ear. Beauty too rich for use, for earth too dear. Did my heart love till now? Forswear its sight, for I ne'er saw true beauty till this night.
Romeo's hopelessly in love from the very first second. And this is an ideal love. You see how he describes her beauty? Beauty too rich for use, for earth too dear. This poetry continues as Romeo and Juliet first speak to each other.
If I profane with my unworthiest hand this holy shrine, the gentle sin is this. My lips, two blushing pilgrims ready stand to smooth that rough touch with a tender kiss.
Good pilgrim, you do wrong your hand too much, which mannerly devotion shows in this. For saints have hands that pilgrims' hands do touch, and palm to palm is holy palmer's kiss.
Have not saints lips, and holy palmers too?
Aye, pilgrim, lips that they must use in prayer.
Oh then, dear saint, let lips do what hands do. They pray, grant thou, lest faith turn to despair.
Saints do not move, though grant for prayer's sake.
Then move not, while my prayer's effect I take. Thus from my lips by thine my sin is purged.
Then have my lips the sin that they have took.
Sin from thy lips? Oh, trespass sweetly urged, give me my sin again.
You kiss by the book.
In this scene, Romeo and Juliet trade the lines of a sonnet with each other. They're actually speaking in the form of a sonnet. It's like they're creating a sonnet as they speak. If you check in your copy of the play, you'll see their dialogue goes on for 14 lines. Of course, not all 14-line combinations are sonnets, but this one is. Romeo and Juliet are really in tune with each other, like they have their own special language. I think you know what I mean.
What do you want to do-wooey tonighty-whitey, lovey-dovey?
Ooh, whatever you want to do-wooey, smoochy-woochie. Well, it's not that bad. In fact, it's not bad at all. The poetry Romeo and Juliet speak is quite beautiful. This special language puts the two into a special world, a perfect world. You'll also find sonnets spoken by the chorus in the prologues at the beginnings of Act 1 and Act 2. Now, as we take a look at the famous balcony scene of Act 2, Scene 2, look for the imagery of light and notice the references to otherworldliness and perfection. What soft, what light through yonder window breaks? It is the east, and Juliet is the sun. Arise, fair sun, and kill the envious moon. It is my lady. Oh, it is my love. Oh, that she knew she were.
Ay me.
She speaks. Oh, speak again, bright angel.
Oh, Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou, Romeo? Deny thy father, and refuse thy name. Or if thou wilt not, be but sworn my love, and I'll no longer be a Capulet. What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. So Romeo would, were he not Romeo called, retain that dear perfection which he owes without that title.
But like all young lovers, they have obstacles to overcome, maybe more than most. I mean, their respective families are involved in a deadly feud. So their love is a forbidden love. They are rebels with a cause, fighting against the conventional world. Shakespeare contrasts these lovers with two other characters, Mercutio and the nurse. Section C. The characters in Romeo and Juliet.
Mercutio and the nurse are two of the most engaging characters in the play, and are actually two of the most popular characters in all of Shakespeare's plays. These characters serve as the foils to Romeo and Juliet.
A foil is a character that acts as a contrast to another character.
Oh, then I see Queen Mab hath been with you.
Mercutio acts as a foil to Romeo. Mercutio is a lusty, passionate young man, very carnal and earthy. He embodies the sexual world, as opposed to Romeo, whose love rises to a higher, more rarefied level after he finds Juliet.
This is the hag, when maids lie on their backs, that presses them and learns them first to bear, making them women of good carriage.
Just because he's different from Romeo doesn't mean he isn't an energetic and fun character. Watch as he playfully taunts his friend about Romeo's supposed beloved Rosaline, when it's really Juliet that Romeo loves.
Romeo, humours, madman, passion, lover, appear thou in the likeness of a sigh? He heareth not, he stirreth not, he moveth not. The ape is dead, and I must conjure him. I conjure thee, by Rosaline's bright eyes, by her high forehead and her scarlet lip, by her fine foot, straight leg, and quivering thigh, and the demeans that there adjacent lie, that in thy likeness thou appear to us.
It's not that Mercutio is a bad guy, it's just that he no longer understands Romeo. Romeo is changing, maturing, learning the importance of true love. Likewise, Juliet is maturing too, and the nurse acts as a foil to her.
The nurse, who is actually more like a nanny to Juliet, is a broadly comic character who often uses sexual innuendo. The nurse embodies the material world. In this short speech, the nurse reveals her interest in money.
Her mother is the lady of the house, and a good lady, and a wise and virtuous. I nursed her daughter that you talked withal. I tell you, he that can lay hold of her shall have the chinks.
So the nurse lives in the conventional world from which Juliet attempts to free herself.
Juliet is barely a teenager, but she really matures through her love for Romeo. Listen to the beautiful love poetry she speaks as she waits for the nightfall that will bring her lover to her, and take special notice of the images of light or the absence of light.
Come, night. Come, Romeo, come, thou day and night. For thou wilt lie upon the wings of night, whiter than new snow upon a raven's back. Come, gentle night. Come, loving, black-browed night. Give me my Romeo. And when I shall die, take him and cut him out in little stars, and he will make the face of heaven so fine that all the world will be in love with night and pay no worship to the garish sun.
All right, let's look for those images of light or absence of light. We've got a lot of nights, 6 in fact. Then we've got whiter than new snow upon a raven's back, which would be quite bright. Then black-browed, which is the absence of light. Next we have little stars, which shine light. And then finally we've got the sun, which she compares to Romeo, who she claims will be brighter than the sun.
You know, everything we've mentioned about the play, young lovers, disapproving families, true love that overcomes any obstacle, is really more appropriate for a comedy, where everything turns out all right in the end. Shakespeare used a similar structure in his comedies As You Like It and A Midsummer Night's Dream.
But isn't this a tragedy? Yes, it is. It says it right on the title page. The Tragedy of Romeo and Juliet. What's going on here?
Well, despite all the fun and frolic of the first 2 acts, Shakespeare pulls the rug out from under us in Act 3 with the deaths of Mercutio and Tybalt. So our happy scenario, Romeo and Juliet meet, fall in love, overcome their family's objections, get married, live happily ever after, just hit a few bumps. From here on out in Acts 4 and 5, events unfold to their tragic conclusion.
To explore how Romeo and Juliet truly works as a tragedy, we will start with an examination of the use of coincidence in the play.
Section D. Coincidences in Romeo and Juliet.
Many of the important events in Romeo and Juliet occur because of coincidence rather than inevitability.
For instance, Romeo just happens to find out about the Capulet ball, the mortal wounding of Mercutio by a mishap. Romeo never receives the information that Juliet is only faking death, and most astonishingly, Romeo kills himself mere seconds before Juliet awakens.
How come the name of the play is Romeo and Juliet, and the two main characters are Romeo and Juliet? It boggles my mind, guys.
That's not really what we mean. But as far as the other coincidences go, when as a theater goer or as a reader we see them as they happen, we think they could have been avoided. To help us understand, let's compare this to Oedipus Rex.
We first meet Oedipus during his investigation and inevitable discovery of the truth. The tragic events have already occurred and cannot be avoided. They're givens. Really, the play is not about these events. It's about Oedipus's discovery of and reaction to these events.
But we see these coincidences happen in Romeo and Juliet, so we really think the couple can just avoid all these silly coincidences. There's an old story about a woman in the audience who stood up right before Romeo was about to drink the poison and yelled, "Don't drink the poison, Romeo! Juliet's not dead!"
That story's not true. But it does bring up a good point.
Nobody would stand up during Oedipus Rex as Oedipus grows closer and closer to the truth and shout, "Don't go there!"
They can't, because Oedipus has already done it. All that remains is the inevitable discovery of the truth. But in Romeo and Juliet, if Romeo had just waited around a few minutes, Juliet would have awoken. Things would have been cool. But he didn't.
So considering these coincidences, how do we evaluate both Romeo and Juliet as tragic figures? Let's explore some questions.
Are they noble figures of a unique stature with true depth of soul? Do they experience a reversal of fortune? Do they endure uncommon suffering? Do they recognize the consequences of their actions?
Romeo and Juliet are highly attractive and sympathetic characters, and we want things to go well for them. Young lovers, though they're certainly universal characters, aren't really extraordinary. So, Romeo and Juliet aren't unique in stature, nor do they contain true depth of soul.
Now, did they experience a reversal of fortune? We'd have to say yes. They go from being happily in love to committing suicide at the end. Next question, do they suffer? Well, they do have their obstacles to overcome, and they do express genuine sorrow for the death of each other.
But because each death comes about through almost sitcom-like coincidences, it seems as if their deaths could have been avoided. But there's not a lot of self-discovery going on here, just a lot of sadness. Terrible sadness, but that's not the same as tragedy.
There is an argument to be made that these bad events occur because the hand of fate is lurking around, making things happen. You know, the star-crossed lover's curse.
But these coincidences just stretch believability to the breaking point. It's not fate that's lurking behind the scenes, just plot devices that do not work.
Either way, we'd have to say that Romeo and Juliet are not grand tragic figures, but they do seem to be healing figures.
Through their deaths, they bring the Capulets and the Montagues together. It's almost as though they're sacrifices that bring an end to the feud.
Let's review what we've learned about Romeo and Juliet. Romeo and Juliet, written around 1595, was Shakespeare's second tragedy, after Titus Andronicus.
The play contains several interesting characters, two of which are obviously Romeo and Juliet themselves. Shakespeare wrote a lot of great romantic Petrarchan verse for these title characters. We've also got Romeo's buddy Mercutio, a passionate guy with a quick wit, and Juliet's nanny, the nurse, who's got a bawdy wit of her own.